Thanks very much for that glowing introduction, Eric. I'm not really sure it's entirely deserved, but thank you very much. As Eric's already said, I work at Sigma Research, which people often think is stigma research, but it's not. It's just an unfortunate hangover of our acronym. We're an applied research group, so we specialize in behavioral and policy aspects of HIV, and we perform a broad range of qualitative and quantitative research related to LGBT health and well-being as well. And we're very lucky at Sigma, I think, because we're a very small team. There's 5 full-time researchers, and that's who we are. And we've got qualitative and quantitative expertise within that group, and we share our methods a lot, and I really benefit from that personally. We start from a standpoint that positions people who take risk firmly within the social context of their own lives, and we also believe that intervening to reduce HIV incidence is best achieved when individuals are informed, enabled, and motivated to take charge of those circumstances in their lives and undertake change on their own behalf. So I'm hoping that this talk today, it'll raise a number of provocative issues, I'm sure, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that we have a chance to exchange later on. Just as that's an overview of who we are. Just to talk about the study that I'm focusing on today a little bit. It's funded by CHAPS, which is the National HIV Prevention Initiative, and that's funded by England's Department of Health. So it's a national initiative funded by the state, and it's HIV prevention for men who have sex with men. We have another separate national intervention that's a partnership program of work targeting Black African people living in the UK as well, because those two populations are where our HIV epidemic resides, which I think is similar to Canada with the addition of Aboriginal groups as well. We undertake qualitative, this was a qualitative research study, and the goal was to gain greater insight into the contexts where men who have diagnosed HIV have sex that carries a risk of potentially infecting their partner with HIV. That report is freely available, and the website will be up at the end, so you can easily download that. What we try our best to do in our unit is make all of our research into practice reports absolutely 100% freely available. Obviously, journal articles are a different issue, but at least you can also find abstracts and stuff on our site, so hopefully it's easily navigable. I absolutely gratefully acknowledge the other authors of the report from Sigma Research. Adam Bourne was the person who actually led the study, and he and I worked together on developing an earlier version of this talk. And these are the agencies that collaborated with us in recruiting to the study, hosting interviews, and working very closely with us. Most of them, but not all of them, are actually members of the CHAPS partnership, and we really benefit from our close connection with community-based agencies. So, on to the study itself. Basically, the data that I'll be talking about today results from 42 face-to-face interviews with individuals. There were about 100 men who came forward to take part in the study through recruitment through the agencies, and we needed to make sure that we had some kind of a sample that made sense. I'll talk about the sampling in a minute. In order to be included in the criteria, you had to be a man who engaged in sex with men within the last 12 months. You had to have diagnosed HIV, and you had to have engaged in unprotected anal intercourse, or UAI, as we all love acronyms, within the previous 12 months. So those were the criteria to be included in the study, and beyond that we were looking to make sure that we had some relative balance in the sample between men who'd been diagnosed for a very long time and men who'd been more recently diagnosed, and we defined recent diagnosis as within the last 2 years, which is just kind of, you pluck that figure out of the air. But we wanted to have some sense of the diagnosis trajectory within the group of men that we interviewed. We also made very sure to make sure that we were interviewing men in high prevalence locations in the UK where there's a lot of HIV within the local population, primarily because there's an urban gay centre there, and people who live out of those locations and in the smaller towns. And really the two high HIV prevalence cities in the UK are London and Manchester. They have big urban gay scenes. There's a lot of presence, sort of sense of presence of HIV within the gay community within those two cities. I would say in many and most other cities and towns in the UK, that is very much less the case. So, in terms of the interview questions itself, each interview lasted between an hour and a half. They were very broad interviews. We wanted to cover in detail men's understandings and experience of risk, obviously. We specifically asked about communication with their sexual partners about their HIV status, details of the most recent experience of unprotected anal intercourse, so getting into real detail about their recollection of the circumstances and the context of the most recent act of unprotected anal intercourse, and general awareness and what their sense and understanding is of a whole range of HIV risk reduction tactics. And I'll just talk about those tactics in a moment. Risk reduction strategies are essentially a way of reducing the possibility of transmitting HIV to a sexual partner. And I would argue that actually not one of them is 100%. And so specifically, there are ways of reducing the possibility that semen that has a high viral load makes its way into a partner who doesn't have HIV. That's kind of what we're talking about. And there are all kinds of different ways in which you can combine different kinds of tactics in order to get there. So one of the ways that you can do that is to not have insertive sex. And because of the way that we set up the study itself, obviously men who 100% of the time made sure that they didn't have any insertive sex of any kind weren't included in this study. They would have a different story to tell. And that story is there. And I think that actually we focus a lot on what happens during insertive sex, and we actually don't often have a sense of what goes on among men who choose not to have insertive sex. And that's not necessarily celibacy, but it's just doing other stuff. Using condoms is obviously a way to make sure that you're avoiding transmission as much as is possible. Again, I think condoms are often advocated and regarded as 100% foolproof, and it's a sort of all or nothing issue, but a lot of people then find in their experience that's not the case. One means of reducing the odds of HIV, the HIV that you know you have, being transmitted to your partner is actually to be the receptive partner. Again, lots of issues around that. There's probably quite a lot of HIV in, sort of rectal mucus, and as the science progresses, we find out much more about the choices and the relative risk related to the choices that people make. But this is certainly a strategy and a tactic that is defined and described in the literature, particularly from our Australian colleagues. Making sure that you don't ejaculate inside your partner if you know that you have HIV can be one way that you would perceive of reducing the risk of HIV. Where there isn't a whole lot of semen, there's probably going to be less HIV being transmitted. Considering your infectiousness, all of the discussion about treatment as prevention and understanding what your viral load is, and thinking about how infectious you might be as a result of what your latest viral load tests are. And ensuring that you have seroconcordant sex. Obviously, there's going to be a considerable amount of things that you can still pass on to your partner if you both have HIV, and I'll discuss that a little bit in this. My colleague Adam has investigated that issue around seroconcordance a little bit further in other papers related to this study. But if you both know that you have HIV, then what you're not going to do is primarily infect one another with HIV again. There might be issues around superinfection, you might pass Hep C to each other, you might pass lots of other STIs to each other, but it might be one means that men use to reduce the risk of making somebody HIV positive. And then there's also the option of using emergency treatment, which is called PEP, stands for post-exposure prophylaxis. And again, if you thought that you exposed a partner to the risk of acquiring HIV, you could encourage them, or they might already know about the options in terms of accessing emergency treatment to reduce the likelihood that that exposure becomes an infection. My understanding is that in Canada, for sexual exposure, PEP isn't massively available. In the UK, policy-wise, it is relatively available. In practice, that depends on who it is that you go and seek the treatment from. So, first and foremost, in terms of the findings and what we, where we got to, just so I can talk through the findings a little bit in some detail with you, all of the men in the study, bar none, wanted to avoid passing on HIV. And, as I go through the findings, that will be more challenging to hold on to. But I think that's something that's really worth holding on to. They were all aware of the consequences of HIV infection and diagnosis on both physical and psychological health and well-being, because they recognized that experience in themselves. However, they also wanted to ensure that they were able to have a satisfying and full life with emotional well-being and sexual well-being. Nearly all of them did have a lot of anal intercourse with multiple concurrent partners before they were diagnosed with HIV. And that's likely to have contributed to how they got HIV in the first place. And while a diagnosis might have dampened what was going on in their sex life for a particular amount of time, often what we found is that at some point later on, there wasn't, they resumed what for them was a normal sex life, which was often having sex with a lot of partners concurrently. And so in order for them to experience sex that was fulfilling, there was also a discussion among a lot of the men that they struggled with condom use. And again, that's going to be a feature of the men who are involved in this study, because we were interviewing men who had a lot of condomless sex. So this is not to say that this represents all HIV positive gay men, not in the least. And so some men actively sought out partners only for unprotected sex. Others had unprotected anal intercourse whenever the opportunity might present itself. And they didn't necessarily seek it out. While others had engaged in unprotected anal intercourse, perhaps over the last year, by something that happened by accident, and it was a bit of a one-off event. Something happened, I took drugs that night, and that was unanticipated and unexpected. And we don't take the position that we can't understand why positive men might want to have sex without condoms, because we recognize that living a life that is totally averse to risk has its own consequences too. So the story of how unprotected sex occurred for these men can best be told by examining what men perceived were the risks or harms associated with unprotected anal intercourse, or UAI, and then how they went about responding to those harms. And that's kind of how we try and unpack it in the report. The potential for passing on HIV was a significant harm that they regarded as being sort of a big concern, and that was connected with unprotected anal intercourse in all the men taking part. They understood how it works, they understood how it was transmitted. However, that was not the only harm that the men in this study perceived with regard to that behavior. So there's physical harm that they talked about quite extensively, and there's non-physical harms. Your perception of one influences your perception of the other. So they start to get intermingled in the data that we collected. And these men are in this position because they're aware of their status. That knowledge influences how they perceive harm and puts them in a very different position from men who are undiagnosed. So a number of men talked about the need to have sex that allowed them not to be continually and fully aware that they had HIV. That freedom and that need for that freedom of expression and that freedom of my sense as a person constantly with HIV, who constantly has these responsibilities, was a big deal. They needed a break from that knowledge. And for these guys in this study, in many cases, having unprotected sex allowed them that pause. And that was significant for them. So as I just said, all respondents were aware that engaging in unprotected anal intercourse could result in the transmission of HIV to another person if their partner didn't already have it. And this potential physical harm to others was a significant concern for nearly all of them. I started off with that point, and it's just worth reiterating. So a number of men also highlighted the physical harms that they faced themselves when having unprotected anal intercourse. In terms of other STIs, only hepatitis seemed to emerge as a significant concern amongst this group, and even then by only a small group of them, like about a fifth within the 42. So most considered that after having an HIV diagnosis, everything else paled into insignificance. And that's been borne to be the case through lots of research that's been undertaken in Canada, in Australia, and also in the UK. HIV is the big one, right? But there is a growing sense of an awareness of hepatitis C and the issues related to that, definitely. Most other STIs were picked up during routine testing, and men felt that they could be treated easily, so it was not necessarily a huge deal, including syphilis, not necessarily a massive deal. A few men were concerned about the possibility of acquiring a superinfection, and by superinfection we mean acquiring another strain of HIV in addition to the one that you were primarily infected with. They were concerned about that if they were having sex with people who also had diagnosed HIV. So there were men who, and again, there weren't many men who had this feeling, but they felt it could reduce their treatment options and leave them susceptible to more bouts of ill health. However, really that was much more an issue for the men who were rather recently diagnosed, men who'd been diagnosed with HIV in the last 2 years, because they were learning about all this stuff and hearing about things from their clinicians and quite wound up about, you know, oh God, so there's like, I could get more HIV? That's, you know, that's a big deal. What we found with those men is if you were recently diagnosed or if you'd been through a stretch of really ill health, you might tend to have superinfection much more in your mind than other men in the study.